Hi, everybody. You're listening to Comics and History, episode number 124, part 1, spotlight on the Spectre during the late Copper Age and the post-Zero Hour era, the Ostrander-Mandrake run. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session. And folks, this is it. We are finally here with our look at what is quite arguably the greatest Spectre run in DC Comics history, talking about the 1992 through 1998 third volume of the Spectre by writer John Ostrander and artist Tom Mandrake. I've been looking so very forward to recording this episode, especially since I had the chance over the summer to read the Ostrander-Mandrake run in its entirety, from issues 1 right through 62, the 0 hour issue, or rather the 0 month issue, the 1995 year 1 annual. Got to read it all in order. This is the series that so many fans of the Spectre or of comics in general just adore. This is the series which takes all of the disparate elements of the Spectre's history, dating right back to the Golden Age, and puts it all together into one coherent, intriguing, engaging timeline. This is also the book which smashes the tired old cliche that the 90s was a vast, barren wasteland of comics that were written in excess and had no real meaning whatsoever and gave no value whatsoever to what came before. This is a title which really honors DC's Golden Age history. It's one of 3 titles put out by DC during the 90s, which really stands out for its timelessness, and that it's a title which you can read right now and it feels current, it feels fresh. And of course, the other 2 books I'm talking about are Starman and Our Man, especially during this time period when DC once again was shunning its Golden Age history, its Golden Age characters. So wonderful to see these 3 titles which sent the message to fans that no, there was a Golden Age in DC's post-crisis history, and while the majority of the Golden Age heroes had been aged to senility or death, there were still at least 3 characters who dated back to the Golden Age or had Golden Age legacy, which they were carrying forward into the modern day. This is a volume which you can read entirely on its own, independently of any other Spectre titles. So if you're a relative newcomer to comics and you're just looking for something new, you can read the Ostrander-Mandrake run and get a beautiful history of the Spectre. Even if you're not normally a comics reader, but you just want to try something new, this is a title which, yes, features a superpowered individual, but it goes so far beyond traditional superhero comic book storytelling at DC or Marvel or other comics publishers for that means. And certainly, if you're a longtime fan of the Spectre and you've been able to read all or the bulk of what came before in the Spectre's history, the Ostrander-Mandrake run is just a beautiful payoff, a beautiful reward in that you see so many elements from different periods in the Spectre's history being brought together, woven together into this really nice narrative. Back when I was spotlighting the Spectre in the Bronze Age, I was talking about how there was some confusion as to where the Spectre was situated in terms of which reality certain stories took place upon. And there are questions about the exact nature of the Jim Corrigan-Spectre relationship. And with regards to that relationship, there's still a sense of mystery in the beginning, but over the course of this book, Ostrander-Mandrake give us a definitive version of the relationship between Jim Corrigan and the Spectre, which really honors, once again, work that was put in by writers and artists such as Bailey, Siegel, Fleischer, Aparo, and Munch. Spoilers abound for this 62 plus issue run, folks. The wonderful thing is that this entire run, with perhaps the exception of the year one annual, is available on DC Comics app as well as Comixology, and for $2 a pop per issue. It's money very well spent. So just heads up, I'm going to be spoiling the heck out of this run. This could easily run into like a 4 or 5 parter, but this is something which I'm trying to record all of the parts now in early October so that in the new year there will still be some episodes coming out in January and February. Alright, I do need to spend a couple of minutes at least talking about the wonderful creative team on this book. Certainly one of the most cohesive creative teams over the past 30 years, given the tendency for creative teams to be switched up after a 12 to 15 issues. Certainly one of the finest creative teams ever put together, and you can tell that each member of the team was thoroughly committed to this title. So let's start off with the writer, John Ostrander, former theologian, and that probably comes as no surprise when reading this volume of the Spectre, as the Spectre is, to some degree, repurposed, in that we see now that the voice really is God, and the Spectre is an aspect of the Judeo-Christian God. The Spectre is God's wrath, the avenging wrath of vengeance. So clearly, Mr. Ostrander was playing on some of his religious insights, his questions in writing this series. He got his big break at DC by writing Legends, and at the time, Len Wein was partnered with Mr. Ostrander as the dialogue master. So it was felt that Mr. Ostrander may not have been entirely up to the task of writing for the voices of characters like Superman and Batman and so on. But clearly by the time of the third volume of The Spectre, John Ostrander had a complete handle on how to write such characters who did pop up at different points in this run. After writing Legends, Mr. Ostrander also wrote the post-crisis volume of Suicide Squad, in which he created a particular character who would later become a member of the Spectre supporting cast in Volume 3. From there, Mr. Ostrander would become the writer on The Fury of Firestorm, and I want to say he changed the Firestorm status quo not once but twice. And it was during the second status quo change that Mr. Ostrander was partnered with Tom Mandrake, and together they brought back Dr. Martin Stein, who had evolved into the elemental Firestorm. That's a good segue into talking about Tom Mandrake, who in so many of the letters pages was referred to by letter writers and editor Pete Tomasi alike as the man who was born to draw the Spectre. I can't think of a finer artist to work with Mr. Ostrander on this volume, given the deep themes which Mr. Ostrander was exploring in this title. And the reason why I refer to this as the Ostrander-Mandrake run is even though Mr. Mandrake was credited as the artist, the penciler and the inker combined, I feel that without his artwork, we'd be missing a fair degree from the story. The visual element is so important in this particular volume of the Spectre. And during this time, Jim Corrigan goes through his incredible journey of self-exploration, self-discovery, and he runs a full gamut of emotions. And Mr. Mandrake does just a wonderful job of showing Jim and the Spectre going through all of these emotions. Anger, hate, rage, sadness, happiness, joy. There are scenes in which the Spectre appears to smile, and it's both heartwarming and terrifying at the same time. Something else which strikes me about Mr. Mandrake's work is how he depicted the Spectre in terms of his physique. Now, from the beginning, the Spectre always had a pretty well defined muscle tone, ab muscles, but he was never a hulking figure. And at points in this run of the Spectre, Mandrake draws the Spectre in such a way that you can see that he moves very fast. And the transformation between Jim Corrigan to the Spectre is almost instantaneous, because we're looking at a Jim Corrigan here who is without a physical body. Yet still, when we see the Spectre, not only does he grow to mammoth size at points, he's jacked. Let's put it that way. And you'll excuse my language for this, but I think it fits in the case of the Spectre. You look at Tom Mandrake's Spectre, and powers aside, Mandrake's Spectre is somebody who could beat the living hell out of a person in an alley with just his feet and his fists. And that makes the Spectre truly terrifying, in that he's not just getting into your head, and he's not just throwing things at you. Just in a good old-fashioned slobber knocker, the Spectre would win easily. I also love the way that Mr. Mandrake draws the hooded cloak that the Spectre wears, and it billows at points, so it isn't wrapped tightly around the Spectre's head at times, and it just gives a more ominous sense to the character. Coincidentally, it was in issue number 99 of Ghosts, which I reviewed back in episode number 122, where Tom Mandrake and future Spectre letterer Todd Klein contributed the artwork and letters to a story. And from the story, you can see that Mr. Mandrake was a young artist at the time, just learning his craft, but right from the beginning, he had the potential to draw horror stories. So that was just fun, seeing his work in a Bronze Age title that also featured the Spectre. Now, this run of the Spectre is one which you really need to read in full color. I don't think this one would read quite as well in an oversized showcase omnibus. Certainly you could enjoy it for the writing and to get a sense of what Mr. Mandrake's pencils and inks look like on their own, but Carla Feeney is just an incredible colorist on this series, and she really complements the ethereal sense that Mr. Mandrake brings in his art.